workshop session. The title for the session is COVID-19 and Open Access Publishing. Where do we go from here? It is organized by NSERC and the panel number is 903. Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping notes as always. Make sure to please turn off your videos and microphones so we don't hear the chaos in your homes and backgrounds. Please also note that this session will be recorded. At least the main room will be recorded, not the breakout session. So please feel free to share your opinions as much as possible in your breakout rooms. Please don't forget to tweet about your favorite events and panels at the conference using @SciencePolicy and hashtag CSPC 2020. And finally, before the end of the panel, you will receive a short survey, mostly as a link in your chat sessions. That should only take a minute or two to fill out, but please do so, especially as we are navigating this new online medium. And we need all your help and feedback to make sure that CSPC can provide better sessions in the future. So without further ado, I will now pass on to Kevin Fitzgibbons, who is the moderator for this session. He's also the acting vice president for communications, corporate and international affairs at NSERC. So over to you, Kevin.
Thank you, Uzma. Merci beaucoup. So yes, everyone, welcome to NSERC's virtual session, the pre-conference workshop, COVID-19 and Open Access Publishing. Where do we go from here? Bonjour à tous et à toutes et bienvenue à la session virtuelle du CRSNG. Le COVID-19 et publication en libre accès. Où allons-nous partir d'ici? So as Suzanne said, I'm Kevin Fitzgibbons. I'm currently acting VP for Communications, Corporate and International Affairs at NSERC. Je m'appelle Kevin Fitzgibbons et je suis vice-président intérimaire de Communication en Affaires Générales et Internationales du CRSNG. Before we start, I'd like to mention that I am speaking to you from unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Nation. And I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the land in which we all call home. From coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory for all Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people. Je prends la parole aujourd'hui depuis le territoire non cédé de la nation Anishinaabe. Je voudrais prendre un moment pour reconnaître l'importance de la terre, du territoire qui est notre chez nous. D'un océan à l'autre, nous reconnaissons le territoire ancestral non cédé de tous les peuples inuits, métis et des Premières Nations. So I'd like everyone to feel free to participate and express themselves in the official language of their choice. Et je vous invite également à participer dans la langue officielle de votre choix. So today, our event has two parts. In the first part, I will moderate a question and answer session that will, period with Canadian experts who are working on open access. You see them in the screen in front of you to find out what changes they've seen in the world of OA before the pandemic began. And in the second part, all participants will be assigned to a breakout room, but we'll have smaller group discussions on actions that can be taken to further advance open access in Canada. So these rooms will be facilitated by 3 members of the Society for Scholarly Publishing Funder Task Force. The task force explores ways that members can interact and engage in a more open, collaborative, and meaningful way with research funders. Suzanne Kettley, who will be speaking with us today, and I are both members of this task force. And I'd like to give a particular shout out to Nick Campbell, the Vice President for Funder Relations at Springer Nature, and also a task force member who's joining us today from London, UK. Nick will be joining us as well in the breakout sessions. So if you have any questions during the event, please add it to the chat and we'll address them in the audience of the Q&A after the last speaker. So before we get started onto the questions, I have some for you. And I have to say, we're going to be doing a poll right now. And I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the fact that yesterday a great Canadian and American, Alex Trebek, passed away, and I have to say at times I was thinking of Jeopardy when I'm asking these kinds of questions. He was a remarkable Canadian, and I think did a lot for opening up people to interesting questions and understanding of our times. So look in the chat box. You should see a poll link. You only have to click on this link once to participate in all the polls. Keep the internet window open, and each poll will automatically refresh on your screen. We will be showing real-time results as the answers come in. After clicking on the poll link, you will be asked for a name you would like the poll system to display to you. I'd recommend, if possible, that you give at least your full name and association, which will be easier for us to acknowledge as needed. So all poll responses are anonymous, and your name will not be associated with any of the sent responses. So here we'll get started. So I hope everyone has their question on the poll. So our first question is, in what region are you located today? Dans quelle région êtes-vous situé aujourd'hui? So click on the poll link included in the chat, which will open up the internet browser. You'll click on the map where you are right now. If you're located outside of Canada, select the bubble outside of Canada. Let's see what we have. I can't, I'm going to squeeze down and look through my thing here. So look, we got pretty good cross-country involvement. It'd be great to see people in the north, but that'll be tough, I know. And a number of people from outside of Canada. So that's great. That's fantastic. So thank you for that. So I have another question for you then. So number 2 is, what is your primary area of work? Quel est votre domaine de travail principal? See things moving. Good. I think that's pretty much close. So being in Ottawa, I can't say I'm not surprised to see heavy participation from government officials. That's great because this is a policy conference, of course, as well as academia and not-for-profit. So things are moving around. I almost feel like I'm watching the results of the American election from last week, but I think they're not quite as close as the last election was, I have to say. So we do have some representatives from libraries, publishers, not-for-profits, some private sector, even media and others. So that's great. It's good to see that, that mix that we have. Okay, so I have a skill testing question for you now. Have you published or deposited a research article as open to access? For example, an OA journal or an online repository. Avez-vous publié ou déposé un article de recherche en libre accès, une revue de libre accès ou un dépôt en ligne? Let's see what kind of answers we have here. Interesting. I think that adds up to about 100. My mathematics tells me so. Robert Harrington can correct me if I'm wrong. Very good. Whoops. Great. So I think we're pretty close. And I can say what I'm really pleased to see is that there is a bit of, certainly we do have people participating who haven't had the experience of publishing open access. So that's extremely helpful for us. And for the others, I think it'll be interesting for us to understand from your perspective. So with that, I'll give you just a few updates before we get into the specific interview questions. It's a little bit of overview from the perspective of the Canadian government and some of the things that we have been doing. So, as many of you know, the Government of Canada supports open science and is continuing to make federal scientific data and scientists more accessible. In this vein, Canada's Chief Science Advisor has recently released a roadmap for open science to provide overarching principles, recommendations to guide science activities in Canada. The recommendations are intended for science and research funded by Canada's federal departments and agencies. So you can see the chat if the links are there. Thank you, Esma. So, Gesundheit. In 2015, Canada's federal granting agencies, being NSERC, of course, SSHRC, and CIHR, released a tri-agency open access policy and publication. By virtue of this policy, the agencies require any publication resulting from their funding be made open access within 12 months of the official publication. And to respond to the global COVID-19 pandemic, research funders have joined global calls for action and revised their OA policies to ensure immediate open access of their research findings. So for example, in March of this year, the chief scientist advisors of over 15 countries issued a call for open access to COVID-19 publications. And I think you might see a link being shared on your chat to that effect. And we, the three agencies, certainly support this call. NSERC and CIHR have also signed the Global Joint Statement on sharing of research data and findings relevant to the COVID-19 outbreak. This is also known as the Wellcome Trust Statement. So following this commitment, NSERC has also asked researchers to make their COVID-19 related publications and data supporting them immediately open access. In other words, no longer a 12-month embargo until we can put them publicly available. We are hopeful that these actions at the federal level, at least, in addition to the millions of dollars in funding awarded for COVID research, will help find solutions to the pandemic. And in some ways, that's the purpose of finding out how those kinds of actions can carry over into what we hope will soon be a post-pandemic period. So let's start by asking some of our experts. And I'd like to begin by asking some questions that are happening at the provincial level. To start off our interviews, I would like to, panel interviews, I'd like to introduce Mylène Deschênes to answer that question for what is happening in Quebec. A bit of background, since 2012, Mylène has been the Director of Ethics and Legal Affairs at les Fonds de Recherche de Québec and has been involved in the development of their OA policy. Depuis 2012, Mylène est la directrice de l'éthique et des affaires juridiques du Fonds de recherche du Québec et participe à l'élaboration de leur politique de libre accès aux publications du FRQ. Mylène, I hope you're there. I'm not sure I see you.
Hi.
Hi. Quelles actions et quels changements au niveau provincial avez-vous observé qui font progresser le libre accès? Et ces actions sont-elles durables après le COVID et d'autres domaines de la recherche? So in English, what actions and changes at the provincial level have you observed that are advancing open access, and are these sustainable post-COVID and for other areas of research? Over to you.
So thanks, Kevin. Well, we too have signed at the FRQ the Wellcome Trust Statement, and we've requested our researchers to, as said in the statement, make their publication available in data. I think that the first thing I want to mention in terms of long-lasting effect is that people would actually see science in the making and see the impact of open access. It's one thing to argue for it, and we've been arguing that it was important, but that the people, the public, the government at every level could see how much it can accelerate science was, I think, extremely important and will have a long-lasting effect. In Quebec, actually, the management of the COVID by the provincial authorities relied heavily on science as elsewhere, and was based on rapidly communicated and evolving research results. So I think this is an important legacy. I think we could do more, though, in terms of connecting scientists with the decision makers to be quite frank, I mean, in the turmoil of the COVID pandemic, even the most committed decision maker cannot absorb all the science that's being produced. And I think one important new role that it has shown is that in an open science world and in an open access world, we nevertheless need to have a scientist that will narrate the story, that will explain what we are seeing, that will make sense of the science that's being published for other people, whether the government or the public. The same goes for the public, I think, who was really interested in hearing about science, but again, they need to see what they find on the internet, openly accessible. What are they seeing? Are they seeing a fully vetted scientific publication or a preprint, an opinion, an hypothesis, a fake news maybe? So I think this role of scientists to accompany open science in the public discussion is really important. Also, I'd like to mention that we kind of notice how language is important. On cite souvent l'importance que le public puisse participer à la science ou comprendre ses tenants et aboutissants, mais si on n'offre pas de la science dans le langage qui est compris par les autorités, qui est compris par le public, on va peut-être manquer certains des bénéfices anticipés de la science ouverte. Donc, c'est important qu'il se fasse, en tout cas au Québec, qu'il se fasse de la science en français ou dans d'autres langues pour que les gens puissent le comprendre. As a funding agency, I mean, we've adopted this policy, but there were also legacy tools for more collaboration, more sharing. We've had our Quebec COVID Biobank. There was a COVID research network that was put together and a registry of research project by the Ministry of Health that was actually connected with the Research Ethics Board approval of the projects. I think all these tools were extremely important in order to accelerate the research and in terms of people talking to each other so that we don't waste time and resources, you know. But it's true, again, that we could do a little bit more. So for instance, this registry would be nice if all the publications that are coming from the research that are mentioned could be kind of connected to the registry, which is not the case yet. To be frank, to be fair, again, I think we felt that the sense of urgency caused by the COVID made us focus maybe a little bit more on open science at large, which include, you know, sharing research hypotheses, methodology, data. And so I think we need to continue to work on bring it towards the open publication. One very important thing that I've personally witnessed and participated in was the discussion about how do we do open access science. For instance, I've had a very interesting discussion about what type of consent form do we need to say to the participants that the research result will be shared with the rest of the world in real time. So I think all this work that's been done is going to be helpful not only in COVID context, but in other contexts. I'd like to end with one challenge though, and I think we need to acknowledge that one, is that it's related to research integrity. As we've seen more open access to publication, and we've also seen more preprints, which were really vital to exchanging information rapidly. It's important to note one thing is that obviously preprints are not peer-reviewed paper and they should not be confused or presented as such. And at another level, on a blog called Retraction Watch, we now have seen 38 COVID-related papers retracted and 4 are awaiting their fate. So, and preprints are overly represented in these retractation. We've also heard about the Lancet Gate. So I think we'll need to think about research integrity in open access publication as being something that we need to work a little bit more on. But to conclude, I think collaboration has always been a feature of the research community, but the intensity and the proof that open science only makes sense for everyone is going to be, I think, the major legacy of the COVID crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup, Mylène. Des très bons points. Excellent points. So I'd like to remind everyone that if you have a question during the event, please add it to the chat and we'll address them during the audience Q&A at the end of this session with the others. So For my second speaker, I'd like to deal with the questions of what changes are actually happening in scholarly publishing and have researchers been experiencing during the pandemic. And to answer this question, I'd like to introduce you and welcome someone who I think is well known in the publishing world, particularly around open access, is Vincent Larivière. So Vincent is a professor of information science at the Université de Montreal, where he holds a Canada Research Chair on the transformations of scholarly communication and serves as an associate vice president in planning and communications. Vincent is also the scientific director of Érudit journal platform. He's associate scientific director for l'Observatoire des sciences et des technologies and a regular member of the Centre interuniversitaire de recherche sur la science et de la technologie, le CIRST. Vincent Larivière est professeur des sciences de l'information de l'Université de Montréal, où il est également titulaire de la chaire de recherche du Canada sur les transformations de la communication savante et vice-recteur associé en planification et communication stratégique. Vincent, le COVID-19 a transformé temporairement ou définitivement de nombreux aspects de la publication scientifique du libre accès, tels les pré-publications dont Mylène avait parlé, l'évaluation par les pairs, ainsi que des questions d'équité, de diversité et d'inclusion. Et par ça, j'inclus aussi la diversité linguistique dans les revues universitaires. Donc, quels problèmes avez-vous rencontrés dans ces domaines pendant le COVID-19 et quels changements souhaiterez-vous voir produire après la pandémie? So in English, I will repeat the question. COVID-19 has temporarily or permanently transformed many aspects of scholarly publishing and open access, such as preprints and peer review, issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion, including language diversity in academic journals. What issues have you seen in the areas of COVID-19, and what changes would you like to see in the post-pandemic? Vincent.
Merci beaucoup, Kevin, pour l'introduction et pour les questions. I would like to make 4 points, basically. One about preprints, one about open data, one about incentives, and the other one about, well, let's say, gender issues in scholarly publishing. And I will actually start with preprints because Mylène ended with that. So what we've seen since let's say, the first few weeks of the pandemic is actually an increase in the number of preprints submitted. And so researchers who were not used to disseminate their research this way actually started to do it because they kind of felt that, well, that was actually necessary. We should not be waiting for things to be peer reviewed to be out there. We need people to be able to read it right now. And of course it leads to let's say, some kind of a confusion between what's reviews and what's not reviewed. But we need to remember that most scientific readers, most scientists are actually reviewers themselves. So they're actually able to judge a paper despite the fact that it has not been reviewed yet. What is probably a bit more problematic is when those non-reviewed yet papers, because they will be reviewed at some point, fall in the hands of journalists who may not always have the expertise to wait and to actually judge the scientific credibility of those papers. That said, we've also seen, and again, Mylène said a few words on that, we've seen quite a few published papers that got retracted, and of course the biggest one is probably the one published in the Lancet on hydroxychloroquine. So there's kind of an interesting way peer review is kind of reshaping, where although pre-pandemic, I did not think that Twitter was such a great tool to discuss science. It did seem that we've had quite a lot of interesting discussions on that social media about papers, where basically we've seen a preprint being published and then a group of scientists basically discussing it in real time. And so that's the most efficient open peer review that I've seen so far. So rising preprints, and this is something that I actually do hope will stay, because I think that we collectively have more advantages than disadvantages there, especially given the fact, as I said, that scientists can themselves review the papers. That being said, we're actually seeing that this growth in preprint is kind of stabilizing. It's not, it's as if everyone rushed to submit their preprints and now not everyone is doing it anymore. So we already see that the growth is not what it used to be. So we'll have to be careful that if we believe collectively that this is a good thing, that we actually put the proper incentives there. And again, just to give more context, astrophysicists, mathematicians, particle physicists have been working with preprints for 30 years now, and their fields are going very well. Second thing is about open data. So of course, we've had the call from the Lancet and from the Wellcome Trust, actually, that the Lancet signed about making all of the data open, and everyone seems to be in favor of that. But that being said, scientists are still not doing it. So we actually, this is a letter that we're submitting in the next few days. We've looked at whether preprints add accompanying data in their submission, were they actually providing the data, and more than half of them are still not doing it. Of course, there's a bit more open data when it comes to preprint that are related to COVID, but still it's less than half. So researchers are still not doing it, because there's one thing to provide open access to the paper. It's something else to actually open the data. It leads to much more scrutiny, and it also leads to, one may say, one losing their comparative edge when it comes to the competition in science. So still, I don't believe that, well, researchers are still not doing it. And I believe that we have not yet collectively put the proper incentives for researchers to do it. So this is something for which everyone hopes that there's a change with the COVID, but we're not seeing it yet in the data. The third point I want to make is about incentives again. So, and we'll have to go back a few months. When this new pneumonia was kind of discovered in Wuhan, in China, the Chinese government sent a few scientists to Wuhan to kind of understand what was in there. And then this group of scientists came back to Beijing with their data. And what they actually wrote was a paper for the New England Journal of Medicine, instead of submitting that paper or advising the Chinese authorities on their findings. So in other words, all of the incentives in the Chinese research system oriented the researchers not to submit something for their community, but actually submit something in English for the international community. And the Chinese government, and at least the research funders, did not react so well with that, because they kind of thought that, well, these new scientific information should be circulated in China. This is something that the population need to understand. At least a group of scientists and medical doctors should have to understand. So they actually did two things in reaction to that. The first thing is that they made illegal all of the cash per publication bonuses that they had put in place over the last decade. So in many universities in China, if you publish a paper in Science, Nature, or the New England, you get tens of thousands of dollars as direct cash bonuses. In some universities, it's more than $150,000 that you get. So all of these things orient researchers into publishing in English in international journals. And so they made those illegal. And they also said that if you are funded, you need to publish a certain proportion of your papers in Chinese journals. So it's kind of the revenge of national journals in China. And this is something that is quite important, because it changes the entire incentive structure, and it may lead to more research published not in English. Now I'll go fast. I know, Kevin, I'm conscious of time. The last point is the decline of women publishing, which is something that has been well documented. In the first few weeks of basically all of the lockdowns at the world level, we've seen a strike decrease in all of the various databases of papers that were led by women, submitted and led by women. Things are starting to improve again since the end of the summer. So we don't know whether this was just a dip and that things will solve themselves naturally. But given that we're still into lockdown in many parts of the world, it remains to be seen whether we can be optimistic on that. I will stop now. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much. Really excellent points. Lots to discuss at the Q&A. So moving right along then, I'm very honored to introduce our next speaker, Lorna Williams. Lorna is Professor Emerita at Indigenous Education, Curriculum and Instruction at the University of Victoria and Canada Research Chair in Education and Linguistics. Lorna, my question for you is, what experience have you had accessing and sharing Indigenous knowledges in the science?
Thank you, Kevin, and thanks for including me in this discussion. And thanks for the question. It's the experiences, not just of me, but of many Indigenous people, is that it's very challenging to get anything on Indigenous knowledge included and published And my most recent experience, for example, was trying to have published 2 texts on Indigenous knowledge and science. It was impossible to find a publisher to publish the work for many reasons. One was because it was because they didn't want to have the language of Indigenous knowledge in the publication, and we didn't want to change it. And so, and the other was, there are so few Indigenous scholars still who are coming along. We need to support the new scholars, and it's extremely difficult for publishers to support new scholars in their writing. And so it's a challenge then to have Indigenous knowledge included. The other experience, I do lots of work with communities and Indigenous languages. And one of the challenges is that over the many, many years of gathering data, of publishing data. For example, linguists collect data, they create dictionaries for language communities, and then the language community lose the rights to their own knowledge, because then through publishing, it's the linguist that has those rights. And that's a real challenge. And right now, there are many communities that are in legal battles to get to access their knowledge. So it's about access, and and this idea about open data is a good one. But I think that it's really important for us to look at the experiences that Indigenous communities have had with this. And because there's so few in Canada anyway, so few people who continue to speak and to hold the knowledge of the languages and of the wisdom of that nation. And it's important that they continue to be able to have access to that, and to be able to use that, to continue to use that knowledge. And so I'm really imploring on the science community, the research community, the publishing community, to really have to address this. And because it's not just, it's important for us, for our communities, for our knowledge systems to continue, but it's also, I think, an important one for people who live in this country. Thank you very much.
Get off my mute. Thank you very much. It's a wonderful perspective. I think that's something that's really important for us to understand. So the sharing of scientific knowledge in Western science has historically been published through articles and journals. And during COVID-19, the majority of scholarly publishers have taken down barriers or paywalls to allow for the immediate dissemination and sharing of research findings. So to talk about the ways publishers are supporting OA, in particular during the pandemic, I'd like to introduce Suzanne Kettley. Suzanne is Executive Director of Canadian Science Publishing, which publishes 24 journals, including Facets, Canada's first multidisciplinary OA science journal. She's also Secretary Treasurer of the Canadian Association for Learner Journals and participates on the SSP Funder Task Force and the STEM Fellowship Board of Directors. So I have a question for you, Suzanne. How can the publishing industry leverage the recent changes to publisher paywalls and still ensure sustainable changes to their business models? Suzanne.
That's a great question. I think it's important to look at the past and compare where we are today in order to answer the question. I don't know how many of you remember the H1N1 pandemic and the fact that Elsevier had created a flu resource center from 41 of its journals, including the Lancet, to create a resource for people where they could get access to research, the researchers in particular. As we all know, Elsevier did not flip its journals to open access after that pandemic was over. So I don't think that the pandemic itself, the current one, COVID, is going to result in everything being open access. However, having said that, the world has changed over the last 10 years, and we are actually seeing a shift in both the behaviors and attitudes towards open access publishing. As you know, major funders, including NSERC, have in recent years been mandating that researchers make the research outputs publicly available, specifically articles, and now data sets are joining them. Even more recently, publishers have been working with academic libraries to develop business models to increase the amount of open access publishing in the scholarly literature. So given the collision of events, perhaps now is the right time for a push to OA. The entire world is focused on solving a public health crisis, which benefits from immediate accessible research for the researchers. And there's a simultaneous discussion that's taking place on increasing open access publishing. So just maybe we're in the right spot to see progress. But how can we leverage the situation caused by COVID-19? I'm not sure we can. At least publishers can't do it alone. This year, CSP was in a position where we could take action when the pandemic was declared. And we, like others on this call, have signed the Welcome Trust call to action to make the research available immediately. And we've done that. We've aggregated all of our coronavirus and related research and made a collection of it that's freely available for everybody. And we continue to add to that collection. We were in a position where we could make that content open because our operational costs are still covered for the most part by subscription revenues. They're collected at the beginning of the year and had already been received by the time the pandemic was declared. So there's little risk that making that content open would affect this year's subscription revenues. But is there anything we've learned this year that will allow us to expand OA to all of our journal content? Not really. Flipping all of our journal content to open access, it still represents a real risk for CSP, which I know is the case for other publishers like us too. We're not for profit and we don't have the same deep pockets and influence of large commercial publishers. And my apologies to those of you on the call who are from them. I have to stress that any risk that we take on switching to a new open access business model is 100% borne by us because the only revenue we receive is through our journals and our services. We don't have any external funding. So had you asked me whether we want to implement a sustainable open access model, my answer would have been absolutely. Open access supports researchers in increasing the research of their own work, provided they can afford to pay in the journal they're publishing in, and it means they can access papers that they need to read. I mentioned a minute ago that some publishers are negotiating deals with library consortia to transition to open access. The models being discussed are really interesting to us because they're transformative in nature and they're removing the burden of payment from the authors, so the libraries are paying for the open access content. It's critical that small publishers like us ensure we're getting involved in these transformative models too, so it's not just the large commercial publishers. And that's why we've begun discussion with potential partners on that, so that we can help to move the needle in open access in Canada. Ironically though, although COVID highlights the importance of immediate open access for research, it's also having an impact on the economy. And it's uncertain what library budgets are going to look like in coming years as the universities look to places to cut. Everybody's concerned about that, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that from our library colleagues. A lack of money in the library coffers will put the success of new transformative models in jeopardy at a critical point in their development. As we know, our current government is a friend of science and research, even fundamental research, which has been lacking at other points in our history. But the thing is, peer review and publication of the results of those research investments are also integral parts of the research cycle, and they need to be supported. As a journal publisher, we see the value in a trusted and robust digital publishing landscape to support peer-reviewed research, one that allows content to be discoverable and is interconnected and interoperable. For the value of our research investments in Canada to be realized, we do need accessible content, not only for researchers solving problems like dealing with COVID, but also, as our colleagues have said, the translated versions for the general public who need credible and validated information to help them with their own day-to-day decisions. It's actually exciting times for scholarly communication if you're not looking at the resource funding aspect of it. And I think we all agree that peer-reviewed research outputs are an essential part of the research cycle. And we all agree that those outputs should be accessible. So as a country, we need to step up and ensure that journals are protected. And if the funding isn't available at the library level for the journals, and I sure hope it will be, but the question will then become, where will the money come from? Because the sustainable models that we're working on will be moot. So in summary, the value of OA publishing has been highlighted by the current situation with COVID, I agree, but there was already an existing shift happening to increasing open access publishing around the world. The irony is that the situation with COVID is not one publishers can leverage to create sustainable open access models. It's quite the opposite. And it's presenting a real risk to the journals if it results in library budgets being slashed. And it's essential that we all come together to try to figure this out. In the meantime, we at CSP will continue our discussions with our partners to see what we can do to implement transformative models, which should radically increase the amount of open access content that we're seeing in our journals. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. And I think you made a very good segue to my next speaker. And I'd like to ask, Susan Haigh to join us. Susan Haigh is Executive Director for Canadian Association of Research Libraries, CARL, an association of Canada's 31 largest research libraries. She oversees a range of national initiatives to promote open scholarship, build research data management capacity, and advocate for research library interest. So Susan, welcome this afternoon. And my question for you is, what systemic changes as it relates to OA do you believe are necessary to sustain the health of academic libraries?
Well, thanks, Kevin. I wanted to say, first of all, that within the university context, academic libraries do anticipate constrained budgets. There have been substantial new costs with the strain that have strained our library budgets already considerably. In preparation for the fall term, libraries, for example, are reporting that they have had to purchase many more ebooks and video streaming rights for content that would normally have been delivered to students offline. At the same time, it seems clear that the pandemic has shown the value of immediate open access and that the time is now. So I appreciate the question about systemic changes. I think there are several changes that need to advance as much as possible and as fast as we can muster at once. I'm going to talk about three, and I think there has been some progress, in fact, on each of them. A first systemic change is new approaches in the scholarly publishing system. We must work collectively to insist on better license terms and prices from the commercial publishers, to be prepared to walk away from deals if need be, and to engage in evidence-based selection. Although transformative agreements offer some promise, we need to be cautious. A recent transformative agreement between Max Planck and Nature will have Max Planck paying €9,500 per article. That's $14,500 Canadian, and that's crazy. We also need to foster and nurture alternatives, both within traditional publishing, such as mega journals, and alongside traditional publishing. We need strong, innovative, homegrown, not-for-profits, university presses, Canadian scholarly publishers, preprint archives, local repositories supporting Green OA. One important step in ensuring the relevance of repositories is the approach being taken by Coalition S and their Plan S, whereby funders require that authors retain rights over their works and that the accepted manuscript must be deposited in a repository CC BY. We need to ask ourselves, what can the public purse afford? And how is that best shared between funders and libraries so that the producer, the researcher, and the consumer, also largely the researcher, for them, the dissemination and access is free and open. A second systemic change I want to highlight is the move to collective action, collective funding, and collective infrastructure. We need to work together. We need to pool funds, align policies, share expertise, and build common infrastructure and services. If everybody pays their share, sustainable services that serve the Academy's interests are built. There are examples of this in play. Both a funder and the library community are investing in Coalition Publica, for example, so that we have an excellent homegrown journal production platform whose direction is OA. Knowing that libraries are actively committing to supporting this platform and other OA services is a key factor in independent Canadian scholarly journals' decision to move to an OA model. Another example of collective investment is the international infrastructure services that are promoted by the Global Sustainability Coalition for Open Science Services, also known as SCOSS. There, Canadian libraries invest consortially and according to their means in not-for-profit free services that they use, and so do other countries. However, to ensure that they can continue to provide support to open scholarship infrastructure, libraries need to be able to change how their budgets are organized and develop new workflows to shift some of their funds from subscription fees to memberships or other contributions to open scholarship infrastructure. This is a necessary evolution for libraries. Strong or renewed commitments to OA from institutions and funders can help ensure that such changes to library spending is possible. Finally, in order for OA to be most successful, there needs to be changes in our reward system. I think one of the biggest system changes, which is truly a fundamental inhibitor to open access still, is needed, and that is to broaden how academics are assessed for promotion and tenure and how universities are assessed for rankings. The library community doesn't own this issue, but it is fundamental for the transition to open access to gain traction. Prestige as a preoccupation is not going away. Can we instead change how it is defined? Everyone knows that the quality of the research, it's the quality of the research that matters, and quality indicators are helpful signposts for that. But we currently rely on narrow and flawed indicators such as journal impact factors. Until universities broaden their approach to research metrics, our progress will be slowed. So universities need to balance their use of journal impact factors and citations with other criteria within the context of promotion and tenure, such as openness and collaboration. Thank you.
Thanks very much. It's so important to get these perspectives too, because it's very much systemic on many levels. Thank you, Susan. So our final speaker before we go to the open session is Clare Appavoo, who is the Executive Director for CRKN, the Canadian Research Knowledge Network, which represents 81 institutions and libraries across the country in large-scale licensing and content acquisition activities. She's been very much a leader in discussions of transformative agreements within the Canadian research community or library community. So with that, I'd like to pass over a question to you, Clare. How can Canadian institutions and their libraries maximize investments during the pandemic and beyond?
Thank you very much, Kevin. I appreciate it. Yeah, I think one thing I really want to highlight that has come out in some of the other speakers already is the notion of collaboration and working collaboratively. And that's something that we are very much doing, and Susan spoke very well of that already in the Canadian academic library community. And for us at CRKN, we're doing that in a variety of different ways. I think for at an international level, we work as a library, Canadian Library, National Library Consortia. We work together with the International Library Consortia community, ICOLC. We've developed statements in response to the COVID pandemic. We've worked nationally with our other regional library consortia to develop a Canadian statement that was specific to our own situation here in Canada and very much address that issue that you and Susan and others have already raised of sustainability and the notion that we are in fact going to be in quite some considerable financial distress in the library community as the situation continues to unfold. I think the other area that we're working in on an international level is well, on a national level, is to ensure on our part at CRKN that we are working together with those large commercial publishers to provide, at least in the short term, we've had some success at achieving financial relief for 2020 and 2021 from our large publishers. I think it's very interesting that Suzanne Kettley drew to our attention the fact that it's easier in some ways to provide financial relief when you've already gathered some of, as a publisher, some of the subscription revenues, but nonetheless, they have responded well, many of them, to this request. We are working really in a very important manner together with the Canadian research community, not just the library community. And I think this is a really important element for us as a country. What we've seen that has been successful in other countries that has been very important is that we are aligned as a research community, that it isn't just the university libraries, as Susan Haigh just said, that we are working together with the funders and with others. And at CRKN, we formed a stakeholder alignment group to help support us in those important negotiations with large commercial publishers. I mean, we negotiate $130 million worth of content a year. So that's a very large, substantial amount of money that's coming out of the academic library system to those large commercial publishers and to Canadian publishers. We wanted to ensure that we have a community that is aligned with us as we approach those negotiations. And we've been successful in having chief science advisors, Dr. Mona Niemer and Dr. Rémi Quérion join us in that alignment group, the funding agencies, CFI, NSERC, SHERC, and to have several university presidents be part of that, the Universities Canada, the U15, and several Canada research chairs as well belong to that group, and to really support the notion that we are trying to achieve not only in terms of open access, but really in terms of sustainability and the need for this research content to be sustainably accessible and preserved for our use into the future, that we are aligned with other members of the research community in achieving those goals. We have also done quite a bit of work, and we built on our conference in 2019 to develop a renewed set of licensing principles that point to some of those key issues: sustainability, equity of access, open access, and transparency, that we can all know what our deals are costing us as we work forward. And in response to that notion of transformation, we continue to work on transformation of large-scale commercial public subscriptions to both pay not only for reading, but also to pay for publication by Canadian authors into those journals. We are working on some deals in that sense, and in particular this year we are focused on one of our key publishers. News to come later in the year on that. And I think that is one method to move us forward. But as I think Suzanne Kettley drew out very nicely, this can't be done by the university libraries alone. This is something that needs to happen with input and funds from the broader community. We can't take on the additional cost of paying for authors to publish without some support from where those funds are currently being generated. So whether that be out of research funds or funding agencies, that needs to be pooled a little bit more effectively. And then finally, I would note that it isn't just about open access is a whole infrastructure that's around that. And I think one of the things that we're very focused on in addition to licensing itself is to working with the broader community for PIDs, for example. We help to support the ORCID Canada Consortium and the DataCite Consortium together with Carl Portage. So building up the infrastructure resources to continue to support what we're doing in open access, I think, is also a key important consideration as well. So yes, we're economically challenged. Yes, we have some opportunities, though, to leverage that in a really sustainable way to drive change and to make our deals more sustainable going forward, to move towards open access, and to do that in a very principled and Canadian way. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And it is great. I think there's been a number of really good ideas on the table, some suggestions, certainly perspectives that have been worthwhile. And I think what I'd like to be able to do is open it up. I'm a little bit conscious of the time right now, because for me, it's the most important thing is for you to talk and provide some questions and see if there's and I notice there's lots of good chat going on right now. So if I may, I'm going to check in to see maybe just a second here now. I've got a couple from, so we'll take about maximum of 10 minutes, if you don't mind, and then take it from there. So the first question, couple of questions are on costs associated with OA publications. Are there efforts to either to make funding agencies or university research institutions cover open access publication fees? And I guess an liberal significant or similar one, in my university, open access is also perceived as having to pay to get your work published because it's not good enough. How can we change that image? And so please, the question is open for, I think there's a number of angles that we could be talking, be it Suzanne, Clare, Vincent, I think has made a point. And I know that noticing that Vincent will have to leave fairly soon, but I think you've got some time. So the floor is open to you among the panelists to respond.
I'll jump in very quickly if I may.
Sure.
So most OA journals don't charge APC, so this is a misconception. Of course, most for-profit publishers, OA journal, charge APC. So again, that's kind of, I guess, where things get conflated. I think everyone agrees that it costs money to publish, but it certainly does not cost as much as most of the for-profit publishers are asking for. So there's a fair price, and without going into the weeds there, the goal of Plan S, among others, is actually to go and get that fair price for APCs.
Good. Claire, I think you were going to say something.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with Vincent's statements. And I think a part of the value of our collective and collaborative negotiation strategies in the library community is that we can help to negotiate. I mean, we've traditionally negotiated the subscription value, so why should we not be able to leverage that same negotiation power to bring down the cost of nominal APC cost, and preferably to be able to do that in a fashion that doesn't mean that the authors have to pay. For example, in the scope 3, Vincent was mentioning the physicists have been very successful in doing open access publishing in the past, and one of the initiatives, global initiatives 3, allows high energy physicists to publish at open access at no charge and no burden to them by library consortia from around the world working together with CERN to develop a model and a negotiation strategy with the publishers in that field. So I think there are methods for us to be able to make that transition at the same time as continuing to support the much needed Canadian infrastructure to support Canadian publication and to develop methods within Canada for open access publishing.
Thank you. Any other, Suzanne, any quick questions, please? And then we'll move on to the next question.
Yes, I wanted to address how do you ensure that open access journals are looked upon fairly? And I think I'm surprised that there are still people who don't believe in the quality of open access journals. But I would say quickly, if you needed to convince somebody of it, have a look at the journal content of the journal that you want to publish in, and look at the article metrics to see how they fare. Look at the editorial board, who's on the board, and are they prominent in their field? And I also think that time is going to fix this, because a lot of open access journals have started up in the last 10 years, and they will be developing their own reputation.
Thank you. So maybe I can go to the next question if you don't mind. Again, this is being sent to me directly from Shannon, who's been moderating this. So this is something maybe I can pass on to Mylène or maybe even Lisa. How to scale real-time peer review on social media of COVID findings by appropriate experts for all research. In fact, this is something that Vincent, I think you spoke about earlier today. So is there some questions that angle that you, the Twitterization of the scientific communication?
Well, as I wrote, I don't think Twitter is sufficient to do peer review, but I do think that it can be a very nice complement to traditional peer review. I think we should move more towards a slow science approach in most fields, and so of course Twitter is in a way the opposite of that. But in the current case of the pandemic, it did help to vet in some way preprints that could be of immediate use, and for which peer review would have, let's say, taken too long to happen. So don't put all of your eggs in the same basket, but definitely for some specific content, it does make sense to use it.
Very good. And there are other formats, online formats as well, that beyond that are worthwhile exploring. So thank you. I'm just trying to keep up with, so this is a question to Suzanne and Nick Campbell and Lisa Hincliffe. So just a second. How much do you see the dissemination of print copies of journals with subscriptions to library a significant cost versus pure online usage of journals now? So maybe I'll start with Suzanne.
Yes.
And then over to Nick.
Yes, thanks for the question, Adrienne. I don't have the numbers at my fingertips, but I can tell you that the cost of the print in comparison to our whole operations has been declining year over year, as we've been printing fewer and fewer copies. But in addition to that, the digital literature right now has so many opportunities for us, whether you're talking about gathering data availability statements from authors, or having permanent object identifiers, or just making sure you're in the right indexers and doing the page composition and having standardized XML. It all costs money, and it's all really worth it, because it means that researchers have, it's a lot faster for them to find the content that they need to do the research. And so it's becoming insignificant, in fact.
Interesting. Nick, your views?
Yes, so I think
Springer Nature World.
Yeah, hi. I concur with everything Suzanne said. So we see print definitely declining as a dissemination approach for scholarly communication in general. I think the books area is one where there's a little bit more. It's hanging around a little bit more for obvious reasons, but definitely the costs are more on the digital side these days, and the developments that need to be put in, both pre and post accept, actually, because you have to put in a lot of development now in the pre-accept processes as well. And I only see those sorts of costs increasing in time as we start to head towards an ecosystem which has more rules that researchers should comply with, and the publishing platforms, whether they be preprint servers all the way through to traditional journals, are tools for ensuring compliance, right? So there's costs involved in that, and we have to develop. And the point Vincent made around social media being a targeted approach. I actually think there's a lot to learn from social media, but I totally agree with the point he made that we need proper, considered assessment of these papers, right? And you could use a Twitter type approach in a closed and considered environment, and that maybe could be something we should be innovating in future. And that costs money to do that innovation.
I think that there's a whole session that you'll be hearing a lot of later in the conference about misinformation, the scientific misinformation, and how to combat that. So I'm going to move along, and I think we'll just take one or two more questions, and then again, I'm just focusing on what Shannon's flipping to me because I can't keep up with the others, but it's a question for Lorna. How can we shape OA practices that are compatible with the ownership and access to Indigenous knowledge? What factors need to be top of mind for us?
Thank you for the question. I think that it's time to be able to look at where the knowledge is coming from when people are working with Indigenous knowledge. And because so often what has happened in the past, which has to change, is that when academics and knowledge gatherers come from outside of the Indigenous community, that the Indigenous people become only people who offer the information, and they're never recognized, never acknowledged, and so there isn't a true collaborative partnership, and so that I think has to change. The other is that, and I saw this a number of years ago, but the practice stopped in many ways, and that was that when scientific researchers go to Indigenous lands, when they go and do research on lands, that they were beginning by first talking with Indigenous people, listening to the stories, and getting the knowledge that people have of the land. And that makes a huge difference in the outcomes of the scientific research. And, and those were, I think, becoming real, true partnerships. And yet again, though, Indigenous people were never acknowledged or credited for that knowledge. And so I think that academia, publishing, and whether it's open or closed or paid for or not, I think that it's time that we need to be able to look at that.
Thank you very much, Lorna. Again, this is an increasingly important part of everybody's business, I would say, is understanding that. So I'm conscious of the time, and I know that there's more questions in the lineup. Maybe we can pick some of these up in the context of the breakouts, because I do want to give you the opportunity to interact a little bit more easily, if you like. And so I'd like to shift us to the second part of today's event, and these are going to be breakout room discussions. So in a few minutes, we will be randomly placed into one of the 3 breakout rooms for a 20-minute discussion, or hopefully full 20-minute discussion to tackle the question of what are the top 3 actions we can take to advance open access in Canada. And as you can see in front of you, you have the list of the facilitators who will be supported by note takers that will guide you through those questions. And then on the other side of when we're on the other side, then we'll be able to discuss those in plenary. So I'd like to welcome our three facilitators. And first and foremost is Adrian. Adrian is joining us today from what I was jokingly calling the epicenter of American electoral democracy for the past week, and even in fact the origin many of that. So welcome to you, and I know that you had quite a weekend yourself. So Adrian is the managing director of publishers at Digital Science and is also the past president of Science and Scholarly Publishing and the current chair of the SSP Funders Task Force. He's also associate editor for Learned Publishing, an ambassador for the Directory of Open Access Journals, and a board member for the Canadian not-for-profit youth organization STEM Fellowship. Next, I'd like to welcome Lisa Janicki Hincliffe, who is joining us from Illinois. She is a professor and coordinator of information literacy services at the instructions at the University Library at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and is also an affiliate faculty in the School of Information Sciences at the university. Lisa is also currently editor of the journal Library Trends and a chef at the Scholarly Kitchen, published by the Society for Scholarly Publishing. That is a must-read publication, and I'm sure that many of you know, but if you don't, please check it out. Some very timely and interesting conversations going on there. And our third facilitator today is Robert Harrington. Vincent had mentioned before how comfortable the mathematicians have been, and he is in fact joining us today from Brookline, Massachusetts, which is near Boston. And Robert is Associate Executive Director of Publishing at the American Mathematical Society and has overall responsibility for publishing in AMS, including books, journals, and electronic problems. And Robert himself is a chef for the Scholarly Kitchen blog and a member of the editorial board of FastPed Bio Advances. So with that, everyone, I'm sure that the magic of Zoom will pop us into rooms and get us to know each other a lot better over the next 15 to 20 minutes. And I look forward to seeing you back in plenary in a few minutes. Avec ça, we're waiting for the next, you should see something pop up on your screen. Just click OK, and we will be there. Bye-bye. Very good. So just checking to see in terms of participants, have we still got a number of people around, participants? 39, I think a few more possibly, although some may have gone for lunch, I'm sure. But it's a good group here. So thank you. Thank you, Uzma, for welcoming us back. I hope you had a chance to have a good discussion within the breakout. And we're going to be coming back now into taking a look at the fourth poll, which is assembling the recommended top 3 actions from each room into one list. So this may take a couple of seconds. I'll leave this back up to, I guess, is it Shannon and Shweta and the others to ensure that we've got something to work with. And so we may need a couple of minutes to rebuild the poll. But just to pick up, first of all, Madria, just very quickly to Adrian, while we're waiting for this to come up, I know you were one of the session. Any quick comments that you'd like to take from your comments before we see this pop up on our poll?
I just think it was a really good discussion. And one of the points really is looking at the whole infrastructure and all the different stakeholders. I don't think one party can do this alone, and figuring out how and what are the best ways to work together. Yeah. It's something we're trying to do on the task force too, right, Kevin? But,
exactly. Elisa, how about in your shop or in your breakout? Anything that came to mind?
So I think what I would sum up is we sort of saw that there's potentially, a number of different units on campuses that could play a role. But there's also this sort of like, we want to use incentives, but maybe we need to use
a bit of hammer.
Incentives, so rewards, but also where is an enforcement mechanism. And we were just getting into looking at what about campus level leadership as opposed to just grassroots.
Very good point. Very good. Robert, how about yourself? How was your session?
We also had a good discussion, and I think we could have gone on for hours. And of course, at some point, the axe came down and we were cut off. But I think and my group, please cut in if I'm not right about this, but the overall theme was one of balance, really. And that one size does not fit all. And the idea that everybody in this ecosystem wants to reach for a goal of openness that is sustainable is there, but we have to really come together collaboratively to try and achieve that. And it's going to be different for different communities. There isn't just gold, there isn't just green, there isn't just diamond. There's lots of different things there that we need to understand, and we need to understand the ecosystem of the funding and how that pools as well.
Yes, I like I mentioned that myself. I like the word ecosystem because it does mean that it's constantly changing. I think when we do get to the other side of all of this, the world will be different, but we don't necessarily know how all of that's going to play out. Timing, the economics of everything, the infrastructure in its own right. So those are the things. And the other point that I think is important to raise is that, yes, we have a pandemic, which is a crisis, a global crisis. But I would say that it's not the only global crisis that we are facing or that we'll be facing. And so somehow the imperatives of understanding how to make the best use of science to support those decision making and to address these challenges still is very much a point. So I'm keeping the room open for comments just as you would like right now, while we're waiting for some of the others to weigh in. Some of the ones that we're pointing out, I noticed, maybe I'll put Janet Halliwell made some really interesting points right up front about funders, but also the various stakeholders that need to be brought forward. Janet, is there anything you wanted to add to that? For putting you on the spot?
Just putting, you are indeed, Kevin.
Yes, I love doing that.
Thank you. I just think that my point was that we have to look at open access and all of the associated elements of that, including the repositories, et cetera, as part of the research infrastructure. And we do need to somehow bring that collectivity together that you and Susan have spoken of so passionately, to really address what is a very different ecosystem. I mean, I like that word ecosystem, and it's probably hopefully it's an adaptive one that will actually recognize the triggers for change and the ultimate outcome that we want. So I think back to the early years when we actually looked at CRDCN as a research infrastructure, and CFI came through and funded it in a way that people said, that's an odd research infrastructure. Clare Appavoo's activity. And then another one, this Canadian Research Data Center Network, which is a very different sort of infrastructure. I think we have to think about the way in which research is changing and how we can adapt what have been in the past somewhat rigid funding approaches to funding and to thinking about it.
Mm-hmm. Very much. I'm leaving the floor open just a couple of minutes because I know that we're working away on getting some results from the poll. Other points that you think might be worth raising at this in our open session? Leanne is there. So just let me, a little bit hard to read, I admit. So maybe what I would like to do here, to walk you through this a little bit. So we've assembled the recommended top 3 actions from each room into one single list. Interesting, for sure. I'll read them off if I can. Targeted money for open access from funders, not necessarily for gold or OA or APCs. Funders should consider publishing infrastructure as part of a research infrastructure fund as such, and it is flipping around. For example, aligning with Plan S. Funders need to incentivize researchers to publish OA to bring about cultural change and peer review. Research excellence, for example, signing the DORA declaration. Collaboration among primary stakeholders, funders, libraries, universities, publishers. Ensure someone is in charge of promoting OA on campus. Now there's an interesting one. VPRs, for example, or creating institutional compliance. So those are a couple of the things. And so I think what we'd like to do is to maybe, you should see an ability for you to rank these. So I'll read them through one more time, and then we'll take you back to giving you a chance to push up and down, and from the 2 arrows, one being up, something that you see is more important, and some that you see maybe less, you can push on the down arrow. So as we go, you can see that Shweta has a poll link to you. And while we're looking at it, I'll read through again. And library contacts for publishers to help authors comply and or institutional policy mandating OA, like the Montreal Neuro Institute, which is, I think, a very good case study in doing this. Pursue a range of open access models for Canada. One size will not necessarily fit all. And then convene a group to discuss possible range of models. A Canadian Open Science Task Force with stakeholders from academia, different types of publishers, etc. There are currently several smaller groups. Maybe they can merge and recognize that the sustainable systems is needed. And then finally, provide strong incentives. Researchers include assessment of OA compliance and tenure portfolios, if this is a requirement. It needs to be transparent and communicated to researchers, possibly making only OA articles or articles deposited in, and then I cannot read the rest, unfortunately. So if you go into your polling, click on the link and see what you think about. So it's starting to pop up now. And we're starting to see a definite trend here. I know what the numbers are, but certainly I know the ranking. Interesting. So let's just give this just a couple of seconds to play out. And I'm not so sure what the access is here, but certainly we're seeing some movement. So just give me a second. Shannon or Shweta, have you pretty much heard from everyone? Is this pretty much as a, I can see this thing is shifting. So
you might have to give a bit more time.
Okay, everyone. I was joking, this is almost like watching the election results popping up on the screen last week in the United States. Tuesday night was quite an interesting time for sure. Okay, so Shweta, you tell me when you think we've kind of landed here. Yes, and we won't take a week to figure out who comes out first. Promise. Okay. So that's interesting for sure. I think you can, hopefully you can see that. I'm going to freeze, do a freeze maybe here. Things may still shift, but I think we have a top point is funders need to incentivize researchers to publish OA, to bring about cultural change and peer review, research excellence, such as actions through DORA and other mechanisms. So that appears to be the first top one. A second, a bit more of a triage here as things move on, and hopefully I'm keeping track. And then collaboration among primary stakeholders, key funders, libraries need to work together to advance OA. And in fact, I think some of these are very interrelated, I would say, as I will go down to it. Providing strong incentives. Researchers including assessment of OA compliance and tenure portfolios. This is well beyond certainly a funder's point of view, but certainly with the institutions. And consider publishing infrastructure as part of research infrastructure and funded as such, aligning with Plan S. And then targeted money for open access from the funders, not necessarily for gold or APCs. And then convening a group of possible range of models, so Canadian Open Science Task Force. So there's some possibilities there. I won't read too much in detail because I think you can see them, and certainly we will publish these as we go forward. And ensuring someone is in charge of promoting OA on campus, VPRs possibly. So a lot of these, while there is a top ranking, I do think that they are interconnected in some ways, and they are certainly more than just one organization or one sector taking the lead. And then pursue a range of access models, and then library contract for publishers to to help authors comply in institutional policy mandating. I've always pointed out, and the Montreal Neuro Institute is a very good example of that. But I've also always said, in this world, your librarian is your very best friend. And I would say that to all librarians, thanks. So with that, I'm going to check in with could we just check and see how much time we've got left? And maybe if there's a possibility, are there other actions that you would like to see taken today or announced? Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres actions que vous semblent nécessaires qui n'ont pas été mentionnées? Let's have a couple of minutes to make these points, because I know that time is going, but I know that there are other possibilities out there, certainly not limited to 9 or 10. So give a couple of seconds. And while we're doing this, I'd like to thank CRKN very much for giving us this tool. This is really helpful to get a sense. No responses, they will appear here. So while we're waiting for those, in recognition of the timing that is needed here, I know that we're almost coming to an end. I don't know if we're over time, but Uzma, you can tell me when we need to start to shut down. But if there's other points that people would like to raise, either verbally, please feel free to do so. We are kind of looking at somewhat towards the end of this. And I see Nick Campbell. Nick, why don't you just, you can say, show us your face here and tell us where your perspective from London before we move.
Yes, I just put a comment in the chat box, and it's so the focus of this session is about open access in Canada, right? And absolutely, it's an appropriate focus. But the point of the entire research ecosystem is that it is an international one, and so Canada, like my home country, Australia, is in many ways a bit of a it's a slave in some ways to the global trends in this area as well. If China and the US and European go in a particular direction, sometimes it's a little bit hard for a sort of medium-sized country like Canada. So that context needs to be taken into account in any plans that you come up with for advancing open access in Canada to in future, I'd say.
Thank you, thanks. So as you can see in front of us, there's a couple that have already posted. Somewhat picking up on your point, I guess, both local and global have ways of a way to summarize broader policies. We talk about interoperability. I think policy interoperability maybe is something to look at. And I know that the task force in some ways that you're involved with, Adrian, and that Adrian's leading with Nick and the others, is trying to do that. Incentivizing students and fellows to publish OA, and funding bodies, how we can add grant criteria in our grant renewals regarding compliance with OA. Something definitely we're considering, and to a certain, practicing up to a certain point. So these are really good points, and I know that they are not there is no one single response here. We wish it would be simple. It's not. We realize that this is important, and I think everyone recognizes it. It's really more a question of how to go about it and to make it work, not just in the context of a global crisis, but in fact something that is more long-standing and that we will continue to have to deal with in a changing environment. So I realize again that I'm probably speaking more than I need to given the time frame. So before we do wrap up, I'd like to, first of all, thank all of you for participating, and particularly for the panelists today. I think that you brought some really good articulated points to the table. I thank you for the facilitators and the people writing up things. We expect to be writing all of this as well. And I'd also like to thank in particular people like Shannon, like Shweta, like Leanne, and others who have been so helpful in making this work, because it's a very good start to a conference that I think is going to be quite interesting this year and valuable. So with that, j'aimerais tout le monde remercier and wish you all the best, and hoping that you'll be able to sit in on some of the other important and I think fascinating sessions in the conference coming up, including one which will be a fireside chat with our Chief Science Advisor in around 3 o'clock. So with that, Uzma, thank you for helping set this up for us. And I think that I'm pretty much done here. I'm told I'm supposed to leave the room while you guys, everyone else, do an evaluation of how good this session was. So is that right, Uzma? Have I got that right?
You can stay because the comments you will not necessarily see right away, but thank you, Kevin, for this really beautifully setups pre-conference session with all the breakout rooms. It was very, very participatory as well, which really helped. We have shared some links in the chat related to providing some review as well as some comments on how this session went. Please take a moment to complete those surveys. It will not take more than 1 to 2 minutes, but it will really help us figure out how you responded and how much you enjoyed this session. We would also really, really like, oh, is the session broken? I'll make sure that the session, I provide the right link. But overall, I really appreciate NSERC and Kevin for moderating the session and also for hosting this session. So thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you very much, Uzma. Is that your bird in the background?
It is. I'm sorry. It sounds a lot
They're having
louder.
fun, just as much fun as we are. So I have a cat, by the way. He's been listening to that, so he wants to. He's very interested.
Yeah,
in
it is so
birds.
funny because I can't really hear it as much as people from can hear it through the mic. Because apparently the frequency is picked up more from in my microphone than I can hear myself. But thank you, everyone.
Good. Very good, everyone, and take care. Stay well. À la prochaine. And
thank you.
Take care, carry on, and open access. Good.